Let's figure out what causes aggression. Are the causes different for animals and modern people?
You look at the neurons under a microscope and you cannot tell the difference. The same chemicals are being used, the same circuitry. This is a part of the brain that is 100 million years old, and it's exactly the same. And you threaten a human and you threaten a monkey, and they're both likely to become aggressive, and you make them afraid, and they are more likely to mistake something neutral for something being aggressive. Wow, it's exactly the same. But then you look at the differences. Chimpanzees murder each other. They use weapons. They will build logs that they use to kill each other. They will have organized violence against each other, just like us. But no chimp has ever killed another chimp over ideology, over religion, over arguments about economic systems. You can be violent as a chimp or a baboon to the individual in the next valley because they're trying to take over your territory, you're trying to take over theirs or whatever. We can kill somebody and we never even see their face because we're in an airplane 30,000 feet up in the air and we press a button. Or in the United States with drone warfare, you have people sitting there in an air-conditioned room with music playing and they're relaxing and having a fine time, and they press a button and somebody in Afghanistan is blown up by a missile. And what we have with humans is we can take the exact same circuitry as any other animal out there, and then we use it in ways that are crazy. You read a book from a story 100 years ago and you feel anger at a character in there. You watch a movie and your blood is boiling, and they're not real. They're computer-generated images and such. That's the thing about us. We use the same circuitry and then we use it in ways that no other animal can dream of.
To your mind, modern human conflicts, wars, revolutions, homicide, are mostly of a biological character, something we have already talked about, or rather a social one, cultural?
They're one and the same. Culture and biology and genes and evolution all work interconnected with each other. How does a rat figure out who is a friend who you cooperate with and defend, who is an outsider who you're willing to attack? It's built around, is this a close relative? Is that a stranger? How does a rat know who's a close relative or stranger? It's through pheromones, olfactory information. A rat can smell a stranger and tell, is this a half brother? Is this a first cousin? Is this a 14th cousin? And this is the case with most species out there. We don't do that. Humans don't have sensory recognition of relatives. We have to think about it. We have to think, is this someone who seems like me? Is this someone who looks like me, who prays like me, who eats like me, who does any of those things? And as soon as you have humans having to think about who counts as an us and who counts as a them, we can be manipulated by the people in power and be manipulated in deciding another group is so different from us, they don't even count as human. And it doesn't even count when you murder them. Or you can have propaganda making it seem so much like the stranger is your brother because you're both wearing the same uniform and you would give up your life for this person. As soon as we get to humans, it is very easy to manipulate us, and every good dictator knows how to do this. And that's the history. The Nazis knew how to do that with the Jews. Every poster showing Jews as rats, as vermin. The Hutu in Rwanda making it with Tutsis. Every picture of them as cockroaches. Western Europe doing this with Muslim immigrants. They're a cancer. They're a cancer growing in our nations now. Every single one of those. If you want to make somebody hate another group so much that they hardly even count as human to them, have the parts of your brain activate like you were looking at an insect, you were looking at a rodent, you were looking at a wound full of maggots crawling there. If you can get that part of the brain activating in somebody when they are thinking about thems, those thems are not even going to count as humans anymore.
А что происходит с человеком?
What is happening to man biologically? Oh, this feeling is unknown to me, but there might be an explanation to that. When you take over a territory of another country and your population goes, well, Russia takes over Crimea, and you feel good about that. What is this?
Once again, I think the key issue is making somebody feel afraid enough. We will give up our lives for our family members. In the military, we will give up our lives for somebody who feels like a family member. And if the outside feels threatening enough, because they are, or because of propaganda, your aggressiveness is out of love for your people, is out of, I fully believe that lots of people in Russia believe that Ukraine can destroy Russia. Ukraine, where Russia is 20 times the size, and the military and all of that, because NATO could come in and all of that, that it's possible for gigantic Russia to sit there and feel as if our very existence is threatened by these other people. And when you get somebody thinking that way, our very existence, the lifestyle that we love, the people that we love, the culture that we love, all of that, if you feel like that is being threatened, you're not even thinking about them when you kill them. All you're thinking about is you and your people who form us.
I do get it that according to Orwell, for a dictator, it is beneficial to keep his people in the state of war, to have an external enemy, because it's easier to manage the population. But why us? Friendship is supposed to be a much more pleasant thing. We feel good. Living in peace is more pleasurable than making war. Still, we seem to easily give up the idea of friendship. Well, if we speak about the relationship of Russia and the Ukraine, we readily give up the idea of friendship and accept the idea of war. Why do we need this emotion? This is so weird.
People, it is easier to make somebody feel afraid than it is to make them feel safe, or to make them feel generous, or we have evolved to be much better at defense than giving up defense. There's a wonderful psychological test where you give someone a story. A king has a subject come in and says, you need to go on this long journey and bring this back or whatever. And if you bring it back, I will give you a huge reward. And if you come back without it, I will kill you. And you take people and sit them down and you give them a version of the story where they bring back the item and the king kills them anyway. Or they come back without the item and the king lets them live, and more complicated versions. People are much, much better at figuring out if somebody has acted more aggressively than they were supposed to, than if somebody acted more generously than they're supposed to. It's a skewing with that. And you see the same thing in monkeys. We have evolved. It is easier to make us feel afraid because that's a good thing for surviving than to make us feel like we are going to gamble everything by reaching out to strangers and say, come be our friends. And again, that is the good strategy of every dictator and filled with propaganda. I am told in Russia that propaganda related to the war is that in eastern Ukraine, in the area where people are Russian sympathizers, that Ukrainian troops went in and crucified a small boy, the son of one of these leaders, and hammered him up and left him there to die. And there was absolutely no evidence for this, but this is exactly how you get people to decide those people are animals. They hardly even count.
3 года. Мальчика на доске объявления распяли, ножом порезали, а маму заставили смотреть, пока она... Это я лично своими глазами видела.
And it is much, much easier to make us decide that a neutral group, they are animals who threaten us, than to make them decide that this neutral group is just like us and we should bring them in. We have evolved to be very sensitive to threat, and lots of people know how to take advantage of that.
Значительная часть Украины, украинского народа, безусловно, не все, и я надеюсь, что даже не большинство, но значительная часть оказались охвачены вот этим безумием нацизма. Что это, просто явление, это основная вообще сила действующей Украины.
Есть с научной точки зрения...
Is there any scientific research that proves that one nation or people is more perceptive to propaganda than another?
That's a great question. Probably cultures that have histories of natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, things of that sort, that have histories of terrible pandemics, that have histories of high population density with food shortages, cultures with a history of this up to 400 years ago are cultures that are more militaristic now. When you look at traditional human populations, they basically come in 3 different types. They're farmers, they're hunter-gatherers who hunt animals and just pick up wild foods to eat, or they are pastoralists, people who wander the desert with their camels or with their reindeer or their cows and all of that. Something you see is if you are a hunter-gatherer, bad people cannot come at night and steal your rainforest. If you're a farmer, people cannot come at night and steal all of your crops. If you're a pastoralist, people can come at night and steal your cows and steal your camels. And what you see is pastoralist cultures are much, much more violent than those from the other 2 groups. And in Africa, in my work there for 30 years, the tribe nearest to me are Maasai. Maasai are pastoralists. They're cow people. And the tribe on the other side of the border raids them about once a year when there's a full moon and steals cows from them. And they go have a battle where 10 people are dead afterward with their spears. And you don't see this in traditional farmers or traditional hunter-gatherers. So different types of ecosystems produce different types of cultures. And yes, some cultures are much more militaristic than others. These cultures of pastoralists, they're the only ones that believe you will go to heaven if you die in battle. They're the only ones that take 13-year-olds and for the next 10 years, they need to be in their military and be a warrior. They're the only ones where men will have 4 or 5 wives. This is the Middle Eastern pastoralists, shepherds and such. So yeah, different cultures have very different levels of it. That's looking at humans over the last 10,000 years. Looking at humans from the last 400 years, cultures where people have been treated very badly by life tend to be more aggressive and more easily propagandized because the leaders there have much more of an incentive to say, those are the people you should hate. They're the ones who are the cause of your problems, not me, not us who are in charge.
Let me clarify. Are the same parts of the brain involved? And do we behave alike when a monkey kills another monkey and when a man sitting in his room pushes a button and someone in Afghanistan dies?
Absolutely. And studies have been done where people are sitting there watching their favorite football team, and you're taking blood from them, measuring stress hormone levels, or they're in a brain scanner, and it is as if they are in the middle of it themselves. It is the same parts of the brain, only if you are somebody who would kill for your football team, you are such a great fan of them. If you're not that interested, it doesn't happen much. A wonderful finding in the United States, spousal abuse, when men beat their wives. You look at men who are very, very committed football fans, and in the afternoon and evening after their home team loses, the rate of beating of wives goes up and the beating of children. It's a football team, and the body is one and the same in those circumstances. And again, no chimpanzee could do that. And we can sit there and hear an abstraction about something far away in space or far away in time, and we're smart enough to fool our brains into thinking it's as real as a chimp biting into our leg.
This sounds terrible. From our modern perspective, when a monkey kills another one, or when ancient people do so, from the outside it looks like there is more stress, more aggression there. But when a man is sitting in a room and, like you said, simply pushes a button, it looks like a routine job. It is hard to make myself believe his brain is boiling like the brain of the early people or monkeys.
Yes, because our brains are sophisticated enough to mistake a book for reality, or a movie for reality, or imagining the enemy of your state that you were doing in by pushing your button and such. But amid that picture, we've got the same wiring of aggression as any other species out there because of the complexities. When you look at the wiring, the amygdala in a human is exactly like in a baboon, in a chimpanzee, in a rat. But because of this cognitive ability, we are the most violent and the most aggressive and the most damaging species on Earth.
Where does aggression come from in people anyway? Can you paint us a picture of what is happening in our body when we are angry with somebody?
Well, I think the most interesting thing about the neurobiology of aggression is that when you look at the part of the brain that is most centrally involved in aggression, it's a brain region called the amygdala. And when you look at the part of the brain that is most involved in fear, it is also the amygdala. And I think what this tells us is you cannot understand the biology of aggression without understanding the biology of organisms that are afraid, that are subordinate, that are anxious, that are frustrated. I think aggression is completely tied into that.
But what is this, the amygdala? You have dedicated lectures to it. What does it look like? Where is it? How did they prove it was the amygdala responsible for human aggression?
The amygdala is a very ancient part of the brain. Basically, every mammal out there has an amygdala, and it works very similarly in all of them. It's part of what is called the limbic system, which is a part of the brain very involved in emotion. But what the amygdala does is learn. It learns what to be afraid of. It learns who you don't like. It learns who is threatening. It learns all of those things in the same way that another part of the brain will learn a mathematical equation for you. The amygdala learns about frightening things, and it learns about aggressive things, and it's not very accurate at it. It's very, very fast, but it's not very accurate. And as a result, you have amygdala-driven aggression that makes mistakes a lot of the time. There's a few very, very rare human diseases where the amygdala is damaged, and only the amygdala. And these are people who are pathologically trustful. You cannot make them change their behavior with negative reinforcement. They play an economic game with somebody else where there's a certain degree of cooperation or competition. And the usual profile you see is the person you were playing against does something untrustworthy and miserable to you. And what you do then is you decrease your cooperation. And there's all sorts of mathematical relationships with this. Take somebody without an amygdala and the other player is robbing them of everything and they don't change their play. They don't change their level of cooperation. The part of the brain that's saying, that was awful what that person just did, and I'm going to shift my behavior appropriately towards being less cooperative or maybe even towards being aggressive, it doesn't respond. You don't see that in them. So all of those types of information collectively teaches you about the amygdala, and there's English scientific journals now. There's a journal called Amygdala, and all it does is publish research about the amygdala, thousands and thousands of studies that have been done on its function.
Are there cases that prove that a person had a larger amygdala and was more aggressive at the same time?
Great example of that is not so much aggression, but fear. Again, linking the two of them. I'm not sure if this is a diagnosis in Russia, post-traumatic stress disorder. You have people coming back from the military, from a sexual assault, from some such thing, and about 15 to 20% of them develop post-traumatic stress disorder. You cannot sleep, you see threat everywhere, and it destroys people's lives. I mean, you still have American veterans from the Vietnam War in the 1960s whose lives are completely crippled by post-traumatic stress disorder. And a very interesting thing is when you look at people with PTSD on a brain scanner, the amygdala gets bigger and it becomes more reactive. And a face that any of us would say is neutral, somebody like that says, that's a threatening face. That face is menacing me. And the amygdala activates when somebody else's would not. And if you show something a face that is actually threatening, everybody's amygdala activates. And 2 minutes later, everybody else's amygdala has gone quiet. Post-traumatic stress disorder, an hour later, it is still activated. And some of the work that I've done is looking at how that happens. It turns out there's a class of hormones that are secreted during stress. And what do? They make neurons in the amygdala grow new connections and new circuits, and the amygdala gets bigger. And it's the stress of combat, of trauma, of some such thing that does that. And that's exactly the case where you see somebody with an enlarged amygdala where they see threat that nobody else does, and they see aggression as a solution to threat that most people don't see. And that amygdala getting that lightning fast reflexive information is all set up to make a mistake. And before you know it, you think the guy who just happens to look in a certain way, the guy is holding the cell phone is actually holding a handgun instead, and you pull that trigger.
How did they figure out and prove that the problem was exactly with the amygdala, that it was amygdala involved in it? Were there any tumors or something? What did the scientific experiment look like when it was first found out?
Yep, if you were a neuroscientist, the greatest thing on earth is war, because you wind up getting soldiers coming back with different types of head injuries. And in the 19th century, the first things we started learning about different parts of the brain came from people coming back from war with injury. The much more modern versions now, whether you are looking at a human or a monkey or a rat, is you use a brain scanner and you see what part of the brain activates during certain behaviors, emotional states. You put in electrodes and you see, when we give a scary face to look at, neurons in the amygdala suddenly get more active. Or you put in a different type of electrode and you stimulate it, and suddenly there's nothing provocative around, but the animal becomes aggressive?
Я правильно понимаю, что
Do I get it right?
ген агрессии,
There is a gene for
существует?
aggression.
А
But have
искали?
they looked for it?
Yes. And, this is the era of people being very excited about genes and genetics. You can sequence the human genome, all of that. And out of that comes this belief that genes control everything. Genes control your cells, your organs, your body, your behavior, all of that. And genes are stupid. Genes have no idea what they're doing. Saying that a gene decides when it activates is like saying a recipe for a cake decides when you are going to make the cake. All genes are is the instruction book, and environment comes along and activates this gene or turns that gene off or things of that sort. Genes are just the code. So for starters, they don't control anything. They're just a recipe book, and environment controls them. Amid that, is there any single gene involved in aggression? And people have believed this is the case forever, and they come up with the gene that explains aggression and the gene that explains sexual orientation and the gene sufficiently so that there's this one gene that lawyers have used in a courtroom to get a murderer have a shorter jail sentence because he has this violence gene, so he couldn't control it. Or there is essentially no behavior in humans that is caused by a single gene. And as a measure of how complicated it is, when people now could look at the entire genome of people and look at every single gene in there, and humans have about 20,000 of them, let's ask the most boring thing you can ask about a human. How tall are they? What do genes have to do with height? And what they've identified so far is more than 800 different genes that help to explain height in humans. And all of those genes put together explained 13% of the variability. So if that's what's going on with height, just imagine since then they have done one for obesity. And I think the last time I saw that, they were up to 1,000 genes on that one. Just imagine what genes have to do with how easy it is to convince you that you should be afraid of those people. Wow, is there a gene for that? How easy is it to figure out the genetics of you could look at somebody who looks completely different from you, but if they are in pain, you will feel that. That's going to be 5,000 genes involved in doing that. Genes, they're interesting. It is very easy for people to get excited about them and to decide that they are more powerful than they actually are.
Я слышала о каком-то
I think I hear about a case when geneticists said that there is a gene for aggression, and thus, if your mother was a maniac, you need to be viewed, as you might commit a similar number of crimes. Was there anything like that?
Yes, that's exactly an example where there's hundreds and hundreds of genes involved. And suppose even there was a gene for aggression. There is not one, but suppose there was one gene for aggression. Oh my God, somebody has the version of that gene that makes them aggressive. That is going to give you no ability to predict, is this someone who is going to go out and kill 10 people? Or is this someone who, when they are playing chess, they're really aggressive in their chess play? That's not going to have anything to do with genes. It's going to be culture. Were their parents loving? Were they abused as a child? Were they all the things having nothing to do with that? Or as another example, rather than genes, a part of the brain that keeps you from doing behavior that is socially inappropriate. It's called the frontal cortex. When you feel like telling somebody you think their hairdo looks ridiculous and you stop yourself because that would not be nice, it's because of your frontal cortex, or any other example like that. And in the United States, at least, 25% of the men in prison who are going to be executed for their murders, that we still do that here, but 25% of the men on what is called death row have a history of concussive damage to their frontal cortex. And when that is damaged, you are not looking at somebody with a bad soul. You are looking at a car whose brakes do not work well anymore. Okay, so that's what the frontal cortex does. But you sit there, and I've had this experience of like working with the defense in a murder trial of somebody with frontal damage, and you're telling the jury, he's got terrible frontal damage, he can't control his behavior, this is not an evil person, this is a neurological problem, all of that. And when the prosecutor then gets to ask me questions, and it's meant to be very hostile, they will say, okay, so if you saw someone who had damage to the frontal cortex and 20% of their cortex was destroyed, can you tell us this is someone who's going to be a murderer? And the answer is absolutely not. For the same amount of damage, this person is going to be a murderer, and that person at parties laughs too loud and stays too long and doesn't notice that everybody else wants to go to sleep. Oh my God, destroy the frontal cortex. And this is someone who, like at a funeral, will talk too loud. Oh my God, they're out of control. That's not neurons and that's not genetics. Were they raised with a stable family? Did their parents love them when they had their injury? Were they taken care of, or were they living on the streets afterward? And yeah, so the same amount of damage. Some people become murderers. Some people laugh too loud in social circumstances for the same gene, or much more realistically, for the same 800 genes. Someone's going to become a murderer and somebody else is going to play chess very aggressively. And the difference between those two have nothing to do with genes. That's all culture and experience. Interestingly, a parallel with that, the hormone that everybody thinks of with aggression is testosterone. And males secreting testosterone. And what everybody thinks is testosterone makes you aggressive. It doesn't do that. Testosterone makes aggressive individuals more aggressive, and it makes you more aggressive to the individuals you were already aggressive to. Like, wonderful example of this, you take 5 monkeys, males, and they form a dominance hierarchy. Number 1, number 5, all of that. And you look, number 1 can beat up 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 2 can beat up 3, 4, 5, so on. You take number 3 and you give him huge amounts of testosterone. Does he get into more aggression now? Absolutely, yes. Does it mean that he is suddenly challenging number 2 and number 1? Not at all. He never goes near them. All he's doing is being a nightmare to numbers 4 and 5. He's aggressing them 10 times as much. Testosterone is not causing aggression. It's increasing the volume of the aggression that was already there, learned socially. So the problem isn't testosterone. The problem is society's rewarding certain types of aggression.
Do I get you right? People like maniacs or serial killers, is there exclusively a social reason for it? And they have nothing different? The neurons are not working differently. Do they do so because they like to kill and are calm while doing it?
Social environment is influencing their behavior by changing their brains. It's not social environment causes behavior. or your brain causes behavior, social environment changes the brain. By the time, and this is a classic one, in cultural anthropology, you look at cultures that are called collectivist cultures. Everybody works together, everybody farms together, and every study out there, it is always people from China, Japan, East Asia. And it has a lot to do with rice farming because you need an entire village to do that. Then you have individualistic cultures, and the United States is the most extreme version of that. And what you see is within 10 minutes of birth, mothers from collectivist cultures, when they are singing to their baby, they sing more softly than mothers from individualistic cultures. You're 10 minutes old, and already your brain is being shaped by what culture you got stuck into. Individualistic versus collectivist culture influences how long a baby cries before a mother picks them up on the average. At what age does a baby sleep alone in a room? All of that. Every step of that, from the time you were 10 minutes old, already your brain is being constructed by the values of your culture. So it's impossible to separate them. There was a study that just came out showing fetuses, third trimester fetuses, there's now fancy enough brain imaging techniques that you could look at the brain of a fetus, and while they are still in the mother's womb, the wealth of the parents, the socioeconomic status of the parents was already a predictor of how fast the brain was growing. If you had poor parents, already on the average, the brain was growing more slowly. You're not even born yet. And social factors like, are you wondering if you are going to be thrown out in the street the end of this month because you cannot pay your rent, raises stress hormone levels in the mother, which gets into the fetus and the fetal brain. And before you're even born, that's already beginning to influence how your brain is constructed. So it's not choosing one or the other. They are exactly the same.
Over the last 2 years, the number of home violence cases have risen in Russia. There were 2,680 women killed in Russia over the last 2 years by their spouses. And there have been over 12,000 women killed over the last 8 years. Do you think there will be a rise in domestic violence now, after the war, when soldiers start coming back home? Now, because they have got used to violence? Is there any social data on that? Experiments?
Absolutely. Because they have just spent time being told that violence is not only okay, it's a good thing. Because they usually come back broken by trauma, broken by the things they have seen and had to do. Because they often come back and realize they were lied to when they were sent off to kill and to die, and this was for nothing, and this was for lies. And it breaks people in many different ways, whether it's violence against children, their wives, whatever, if it's depression, if it's alcohol. I think these are circumstances where people come back broken and they have been used as tools, and they've been taught that aggression is part of their orchestration of things that they have available for them to do. So I think there absolutely could be an increase.
If that's how things are, I understand there must be some drugs, some antidepressants, something that can calm them. Have they tried removing the amygdala altogether to make people calm, not angry, not willing to make wars?
The dogma here, at least among psychiatry, is that nobody is cured of post-traumatic stress disorder. What you learn how to do is keep it under control so it doesn't ruin your life. It just ruins every time you go to sleep and your mind is rushing with it. One of the things my laboratory did, we were exploring a technique of gene therapy within the brain, taking genes and sticking them in different brain regions and changing function. And one of the things we did was stick in a gene that breaks down these stress hormones. And when you do that, the stress hormones no longer cause the amygdala to expand, no longer cause that response. This was not in humans, this was in lab rats. So maybe techniques like that, there's some very sophisticated psychological techniques that are being used now that may help with that. We're not very good at it right now. Hopefully we will get better.
Have such experiments been done on people?
Too difficult. I've been working in that area for 30 years. And every year we say, this is wonderful what we're finding out with rats, and soon we'll be able to test it in humans, and it's going to be fabulous. And 30 years later, the brain is a hard thing to manipulate, especially if you're have a big thick skull and you don't grab someone and hold them down and drill a hole in their head and see what you can do there. Human gene therapy, by now, it's practically children in elementary school can do gene therapy on diseases of the liver, of the kidneys. It's incredibly easy. The brain is 20 years behind every other part of the body when it comes to new science.
Everybody out. All right, come on. Up. You smile to him, Anthony. You get down here and do 10 push-ups. 2, 3.
And while I was doing it, I didn't feel any regret. I didn't feel any guilt. It was only afterwards when I began to reflect on what I had done that this behavior began to dawn on me, and I realized that this was a part of me I hadn't really noticed before.
Stanford prison experiment. I can't help asking you about it since you've been working at Stanford University for a long time and you must have known it from the inside. When some people were playing the roles of the inmates and the others of the wardens, and the experiment had to be stopped earlier than it was planned, and later it was found out that the scientist behind the experiment was pushing people to aggression. But how was it in reality?
That's exactly the case. It happened in the building next door to mine when I was first coming to Stanford, trying to get a job there. I was going through that building. I said, this looks so familiar. This was the prison. This is where they did the prison experiment. It's a part of the mythology of the university. The man who ran the experiment, a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo, who he's in his 80s now. He's a friend. He took me under his wing. But he is a very charismatic, strong personality. And he played the role of the warden, the person in charge of the prison. And everybody, the guards were just reading all of the cues from him that he wanted to see chaos. And since then, there was a very good study in England that was done where they repeated the Stanford prison setup, but they had a completely different structure of authority amongst the guards. And what happened there is the prisoners organized and overthrew the guards and formed a collective. Totally different outcome than. So that's one of the problems. Everybody knows about the Stanford prison study, and almost no one knows that confound. A similar experiment that was carried out in the 1960s by a psychologist named Stanley Milgram, where he told people, okay, this person in the next room, you're looking at them through a glass, they have wires to them, and if they give the wrong answer to a question, you need to give them a shock. And you need to make it, if they have 2 in a row, make the shock a little bit stronger. 3 in a row, make the shock a little bit stronger. And the finding that everybody learns in every textbook is 70% of people were willing to do it, were willing to follow this command. And the person in the next room was an actor. The person was trained at the shock. They would shriek. Eventually, they fell over. They clutched their chest, all of that, like great drama.
Next one. Well, you gotta keep getting a shock if you don't answer. The next one is Rich, 330 volts.
Oh my God, 70% of people were following orders. They would have marched off and rounded up people for the concentration camps, all of that. What people now realize is the majority of those people knew that this was staged. This was just acting. And at the time, everybody learns, oh my God, all of the guards in the Stanford prison experiment became savages, and 3/4 of people will follow orders to shock an innocent person to the point where they fall over. And yes, exactly as you said, this is not the reality of those. Very interestingly, Stanley Milgram, whose parents survived Hitler, Stanley Milgram and Zimbardo, who did the Stanford experiment, they were friends together in high school. Okay. Which is amazing. That I don't know how that happened, but yes, they knew each other in high school, and the two of them did the 2 most disturbing experiments, suggesting like anybody could be a Nazi. And what the studies really showed was that was not the case.
Marina Abramovic, a Serbian artist, did an experiment in the 90s when she laid out different tools. You might know there were ropes, a knife, gun, and she said to the museum visitors they could do whatever they wanted to her body, and they did. And at every step, with every visitor, they were getting more and more aggressive. Was it something like, I'm playing a computer game, I'm not really killing, I'm participating in an experiment, or is it something different?
I think it is both. I think the popularity of video games, a whole generation growing up, where violence like that seems completely normal, I think it is reflecting a pull, a biological pull towards aggression in some people. And when it feels like it is just a game, it becomes even more so. Amid that, though, there's a literature, like every single stage when television began to have violent programs on it, everyone said, oh my God, it's going to make children sociopaths. They're all going to grow up being violent. And when movies began to be more violent, the same, oh my God, and now video games and all of that. And what the studies show is violent media, violent movies, violent video games, they make children who are already aggressive more aggressive. They do nothing to the other children. All they do is take the children who already have a tendency towards aggression and say, it's allowed, and it doesn't even count. And look, they're doing it too. What you see with a lot of things with that.
Can you then say that the events in Bucha or Irpin is a Stanford experiment being carried out in real life?
My guess is it was not every Russian soldier. It was a small subset of them. And what the studies during the Vietnam War, American soldiers who committed atrocities against Vietnamese, it was a tiny percentage of the troops, like 1% of the troops accounted for 90% of the atrocities, that sort of thing. So I think that's exactly a case where somebody who is a monster already, this is a circumstance that says, wonderful, go for it. I think it says very little about Russians. It said very little about Americans in Vietnam. It said very little any of these cases, but it says something about the sickest and most damaging among us. Those are exactly circumstances that say, these are enemies. They hardly even count. Kill the civilians, rape the women. They don't even count as us, and they are threatening to destroy your homeland.
Но я все пытаюсь доказать за этого ученого Стэнфордский эксперимент.
I'm still trying to prove this for the Stanford scientist. Not sure how it is in the States, but in Russia, if a person holds more or less important position that gives power, say an old lady at a reception somewhere, they tend to be more aggressive right away. How is it connected? Why? Doesn't it prove that if a person is given the slightest power, he gets more aggressive?
Enormously.
I can't help asking you, the person who has spent so much time with monkeys. In movies, they often show us a war between people and monkeys, a fantasy like that. Do you think evolution might have gone differently and only one species could have survived?
Well, separate of the fact that I do not think this would ever happen, species are driven into extinction by other species that hunt them, not go to war with them. They hunt them, and that is very rarely the case. Because by definition, if this species is killing so many of them for food that there's not that many of them left, this species is going to starve. And one of the principles in ecology is predator species do not control the number of prey species. Prey species control the number of predators. It's that direction. So the only times you would see a species driving another one into extinction from their behavior itself, it's usually from hunting. And even that is very rare. What did humans do to the Neanderthals? No one is ever going to know. What is clear, though, is a lot of humans and a lot of Neanderthals made it. 4% of the DNA in Europeans is Neanderthal in its origins. So, it's easy to come up with a scenario that humans killed the Neanderthals into extinction. They outcompeted them for food. Nobody knows. But I think the notion of one species driving another one into extinction is a very, very rare, unlikely possibility, despite what you see in movies.
How did people overcome cannibalism?
Of course, there are rare cases, a group of people who were stuck all winter in the snow in the mountains, an airplane crash, and where you see cannibalism. But it turns out when you look at the anthropological literature, the cannibalism that we all think of, oh, you kill your enemies and eat them and that sort of thing, there's almost no cases of that. What that turns out to almost always be the case is somebody telling the anthropologist, the people upriver, do you know what they do? They eat their dead. Can you believe that? And when you investigate it, it is not really the case. About the only example of what would be called exo-cannibalism, eating somebody from outside your group, was the Aztec Empire in Mexico, because they had a shortage of animal protein and they built a whole culture around killing of enemy captives and things like that. What is much more interesting is cases of endo-cannibalism, cannibalism within a group. And you see this in New Guinea among headhunters, among forest warriors way up in the rainforests there. And you see endocannibalism. What does that look like? Your mother dies in old age, and what you do is you cook her, and the entire village comes, and the way you are like a loving child to her is you have this endocannibalistic ceremony. And that's very rare. That's one of the only cultures that have been found to do that. But that one is much better documented than any cases of, oh my God, those people living there, they eat people, they eat you if they capture you. Among these New Guinea Highlanders, this endocannibalism is like an established part of their religion. It was the case up until around the 1970s, 1980s, and it's almost gone by now. And because of missionaries, because of the government putting on pressure. And you go and you talk to elderly people there, and they say, these kids these days, this is terrible. When I die, who is going to cook me and serve me? It's cultural change. All these kids are interested in is hamburgers and things of that sort. There's a fascinating neurological disease called Kuru, which was only found in this one tribe in the New Guinea Highlands. And it started with one individual, they think about 200 years ago, and it's an infectious particle that winds up in the brain, which would be consumed in one of these ceremonies and passed on to the next generation, and consumed and passed on. And that was a whole new type of neurological disease built around that. There's no other example of that disease anywhere in the world. But when you look at sort of the storybook versions of cannibalism, it's mostly one tribe trying to make another tribe sound like a bunch of savages.
Animals killing animals of the same kind. Say a monkey kills a monkey, does it then eat it? Or do they only eat other species?
Basically not. You see that in some species like hyenas, and even them you don't see much of it. No, that's all sorts of social species out there avoid incest, mating with a close relative. All sorts of species tend to avoid cannibalism of their own group and such. That seems to be very widespread among animal species. So that is rare everywhere you look. Exceptions are, in some cases, some rodent species where you have a male and a female with pups, and the male is driven out by another male who comes in. What he will do at that point is kill all the pups belonging to the previous male. And what he will often do is eat them at that point. You see in some species, pigs, for example, if you're a mama pig and you've just given birth to 10 piglets, and one of them is very weak and one of them is a lot smaller, and that one is not going to survive, the mother will kill and eat that one. That often happens. But as a defeating your enemy in battle and then you eat them afterward, very, very little of that in the animal world.
Is that because they understand it's a relative, or because there is no neural circuit that would tell them to eat one of their own kind?
It could be one or the other. The other possibility is it may not taste good. It may get your stomach upset. Literally, there is reason to think that one of the reasons why humans survived as a species, we're weak, we're slow, we're like every animal out there could kill us, is it happens that human muscle has a lot of acid in it, lactic acid. That's just our metabolism. And human meat doesn't taste very good to lions and tigers and such. So they've got to be really desperate before they're willing to eat some disgusting human. And maybe that's why we survived as a species. So it could be some sort of psychological state. It could be a biological, neurobiological. It could be something like your stomach does not have the enzymes to break it down, and every time you eat one of those, you're sick afterwards, so I'm not going to eat them.
Do I get it right that agriculture has changed our aggressiveness from the point of view of evolution?
Yes. There is a whole school of anthropologists who say humans have been violent, humans have had warfare all the way back to when humans and chimps split off. It's 5 million, 6 million years old, and that is like in our genes, that's in our DNA. When you look at things closely, warfare was not invented until humans invented agriculture. What agriculture does, it's a much more efficient way of creating food than hunter-gathering. You can get surplus. You can get more surplus than you need. And as soon as you have surplus, you've got unequal division of surplus. You have class. You've got hierarchy. Hunter-gatherers do not go to war against other hunter-gatherers because everybody has a valley and everybody has the same plants and everybody has the same animals and all of that. And as soon as you invent material culture with agriculture, suddenly there's haves and have-nots. And suddenly you want their territory and you want their surplus, and suddenly you have hierarchy and you have kings and leaders and such suppressing those below. When you look at the archaeological and the paleontological evidence, there's plenty of evidence of one person killing another person. I think the oldest evidence now for that is 20,000 years ago or so. But it's not until agriculture that people began to organize themselves into armies that would go against each other. You know, it's obviously a silly way to state it, but I think inventing agriculture was the worst mistake humans ever made. It was a terrible mistake. You invent famines, you invent droughts, you invent warfare, you invent all of that. As soon as agriculture was invented, humans started getting shorter and living shorter all the way for these thousands of years until around the 19th century. That's how bad agriculture was this terrible, stupid invention because, among other things, it invented warfare. So, yeah, it's absolutely right. This is a fairly recent human invention. Modern humans spent 90% of their history without warfare.
The original title of this session was Everything You Know is Wrong, and I'm going to present evidence that this particular part of our common understanding is wrong. That in fact, our ancestors were far more violent than we are, that violence has been in decline for long stretches of time, and that today we are probably living in the most peaceful time in our species' existence.
Знаете ли вы Стивена Пинкера? Это американский
I don't know if you know Steven Pinker. He's an American scientist who specializes in the field of experimental psychology. He published a book called The Best in Us, where he proves that we have become kinder, better, and more empathetic. Would you challenge his opinion or accept it?
Сегодня с ним поспорить, или вы согласны?
He is a brilliant man. I know him a little bit. He is a very good speaker and writer. So it is hard to take him on, but he is one of the strongest believers in the notion that humans have had warfare for 5 million years. And he reports the literature. He picks this study, picks that study, instead of looking at the whole literature and such. His whole argument has been humans have been miserable and horrible and violent for 5 million years until the Enlightenment and Western civilization. What I think instead is human hunter-gatherers for 5 million years had no warfare, and it wasn't until agriculture, and then something happened in the Enlightenment. So we differ with that. The question is what happened in the Enlightenment. And his view is controversial because it's saying, oh, thank God, if this is a more peaceful planet now than it was 500 years ago, it's because of white Christian culture and the Enlightenment, which ignores a lot of the planet. Also, when he argues that the world since the Second World War has become more peaceful, and he argues that very strongly, what he is arguing is Europe and white people have become more peaceful. And what the US and the Soviet Union figured out how to do is have somebody else fight their wars. There was one period when I was spending time in Africa where Ethiopia and Somalia were at war with each other. And Somalia was Marxist and getting Soviet weapons, and Ethiopia was getting American weapons. And then there was a coup and governments were overthrown, and suddenly it was Ethiopia that was Marxist getting Soviet weapons, and Somalia that was the best friend of the United States getting. So one reason why Europe has become more peaceful is we figured out how to have other people fight our wars for it, which is a pretty recent invention. Where I think he is right is the average person has become more peaceful, in the sense that in the United States, 200 years ago, the average person would have said slavery is okay. It is okay for 6-year-old children to work in factories and be worked to death. It is okay if somebody wants to beat their horse to death because the horse is pulling their carriage slowly. And something has changed so that now 99% of people think that is terrible. Individual levels of empathy and kindness and things like that have absolutely gotten better over these last 200 years. And you look at some of the things that were invented, the United Nations, the Geneva Convention, the Red Cross, the Doctors Without Borders, all of these were invented in the last half century or so. So things have gotten better in that regard. The ways in which they have not is you get somebody who is violent now, and instead of taking a club and hitting an innocent person over the head in their medieval village, they now have an automatic weapon where they can shoot 30 people in 10 seconds. Or instead of having your army invade the neighbors with your cavalry, you now release poison gas on them, as the Iran-Iraqi war. So I think the Pinker is right that the average person has become more peaceful and more empathic. And some of it has to do with European culture, hooray for that, but not all of it. But at the same time, the people who are evil and damaging now can do so much more damage than the evil damaging people in the past. I mean, what Hitler did was, in the 1920s, this man, Henry Ford, in the United States, figured out how to automate, how to make the construction of an automobile completely automatic in a factory. And just, you could produce 40 of them a day, and a person working there was like a cog in a machine, just doing their thing over and over. Every 10 seconds, they had to turn a bolt on the next one. And what Hitler did was turn killing humans into a factory operation also. That was very 20th century. And that is what the worst of us can do now. At the same time, we've got the exact same wiring as any other animal out there, built around empathy and social affiliation. And it's exactly the same, except we can be empathic to somebody on the other side of the planet and send money to them. Or we can sit and read about how the volcanic explosion in Pompeii 2,000 years ago, seeing people who died sheltering their child, and you see the casts of it, and you can feel their pain 2,000 years later. Or again, you can read a book and your heart breaks over a character, we are smart enough that we are capable of being the most violent, horrible species on Earth and the most altruistic. And in both cases, we are able to do it in ways that no other animal can understand.
Robert, do you think tolerance is a natural state of a human? Or is it rather a made-up cultural norm?
I'm definitely of the opinion that most of the interesting things about humans were not invented by humans. And you can see precedent for it, other primate species. I'm not very impressed with how much human culture has invented wonderful things.
Okay, talking about animals and their tolerance, what is it like, tolerance in animals, not people?
Yeah, a great one would be basically you look at a troop of baboons, which is what I've spent 30 years studying, and tolerance consists of a new young male will join a group, and does everybody beat up on him the next day? Does everybody take out their frustrations on him? Is he allowed to sit among everyone? Is he allowed to groom with other individuals? And different baboon troops have very different levels of tolerance, where in some troops, a new individual, it will take 70 days before anyone will interact with them. In other troops, it takes 3 days. So not just humans who can show tolerance, but also tremendous variation from one group of humans or baboons to another.
As a biologist, would you say the fittest survive or the friendliest?
The thinking about Darwin, not Darwin himself, but people who misinterpreted Darwin, the idea that animals behave for the good of their own species, and the idea that what evolution is about is survival of the fittest. And in the 1960s, what swept through was a recognition, both from animal behavior and from genetics, animals don't behave for the good of the species. They behave to leave copies of their own genes in the next generation, or genes of their close relatives to do the same. And it's not survival. From the standpoint of evolution, you can live to be 500 years old, and if you don't pass on the copies of your genes, you are invisible to evolution. So it's passing on copies of genes, and it's doing it for the good of you and individuals who share your genes, and it's reproduction rather than mere survival. So as soon as people sort of figured that out, it brought in this era that thus everything about evolution is about aggression and competition and winning and being high-ranking and leaving more copies of your genes. And that was the next mistake that dominated the field for the next 30 years. And what we know by now is there are as many evolutionary models to start cooperation as there is to start aggression. When you look at various species, when you look at bonobo chimpanzees, and you look at the genetics of which males are passing on their genes, it's not the most aggressive ones. It's the ones who the females like and go and mate with them. This whole revolution that evolution is not about competition and aggression. It's about competition and aggression in some settings and cooperation and altruism in other settings. Interestingly, the first person who sort of thought through this was Prince Peter Kropotkin in 1906. He was 60 years ahead of the whole literature in a book that he published saying evolution is driven by cooperation, not by violence. And he was some crazy Bolshevik. Let's pay no attention to him. And he was 60 years ahead of every other evolutionary biologist. What we now know is sometimes cooperation helps, sometimes aggression helps. And the best thing you want to be is very smart at knowing when to do this and when to do that, and not confuse the two.
Do you think in the future there is a possibility of a war with a different species, say with robots?
No, I think humans will always be much too busy having wars with each other. I think we can count on that with, unfortunately, a lot of confidence.
Thank you so much, Robert.